Hey, I would like to read you a part of what Brian and I have been working on lately. We have been starting to write a fantasy novel, or probably like a series of fantasy novels, and I want to share some of that with you. What I am going to start reading is part of Mo's story. So, it's not this is gonna sound weird. It's not the beginning of like the overarching story itself. It's the beginning of like one specific character's story. And you don't really need to know necessarily like the other things that are going on in the rest of the world at this point to be able to like follow this. But I think it's important for like pacing reasons and stuff like that to note that this is like not the very beginning of like the book or the first book or whatever. Um, yeah. So I'm gonna read this to you, and we would super love your feedback. We have done a whole lot of world building and stuff like that, but we're still fairly early in the actual like writing process. Um, I would love whatever kind of feedback you have. If you love it, please tell me. If you don't, please tell me and try to identify why. We prefer constructive feedback. Um, but there are also a couple of specific things that I'm like more curious about, I guess. First is pacing. Is the pacing working for you? Is it not? The weird choice I make 3 pages in, does that work for you or not? Um, and second big thing is oh, is the amount of information that I'm giving you about the like world this is taking place in good or not? Basically, what I mean by that is like, do you feel like you have so little information that you can't follow what's happening or why it's happening? Or do you just feel like you really want to know more? Yeah, I think that's a good way of like describing what I'm trying to get at. Um, so I'm gonna read this to you in like roughly 10-minute chunks just to kind of keep it broken up a little bit. And I don't know how far I'm gonna get tonight, but I'll just keep posting them as we like have stuff. Yeah. So, um, yeah. I am Scribe Magnanimous of the first tower in the city of Tau, county of Yellow Reed Sway, in the free state of Asuria. You would say the Crystal Cities, if indeed you've heard of my country at all. It appears many now in the world believe my country to be meth. I am a scribe, a librarian, a scholar, a storyteller. I've been given to understand that this will probably mean little to you, but where I come from, knowledge is sacred, and wisdom is power. We know who we are because our stories tell us, and we know where we're going because we record where we've been. On the day I was first drawn into this conflict, the first contact I or any of my people have had with people living outside our walls in well over 1,000 years, I was rather begrudgingly doing one of my favorite things: telling a story. I'd not yet ascended to cranehood, and the masters were becoming increasingly concerned, perhaps more accurately frustrated, at the distinct possibility that I might never do so. I can't exactly blame them for that. Of all the things I have achieved in the last years, cranehood is still not one. As such, I was relegated to instructing the fledglings. This task is meant for prospects younger than I, and I think it was meant to be demeaning. Some sort of punishment for being the oldest in the nest who had not ascended, given up, or been politely but firmly asked to leave. In truth, though, I quite enjoy teaching children, and storytelling, and my particular skill set was far too valuable to the masters to give up on that easily, even if there were ever louder complaints from several of them about my continued inability to sprout wings and fly. They'd had such hopes for me. They shook their heads and cited lack of discipline and continued allowing me to teach the fledglings and collect stories. Such was life for a time. But I digress. As I said before, I quite enjoy instructing the fledglings. I tell them stories and we discuss them after. Children have the most interesting minds. On this particular day, though, I was somewhat distracted. 4 women had just done what no outsider had accomplished since the Great Walls were constructed. They flew over them. This isn't as easy as it sounds. The great outer walls of my country are as high as mountains, shine bright like diamonds, and are dizzying to behold. This isn't metaphor. It is truth. Already rumors abounded in the city. The most interesting and consistent was that they could fly, but they had no wings. I wanted desperately to meet them, to hear their stories, to learn of the world outside our walls and experience that world through them. I was frustrated because I felt this would be quite impossible. No crane master, except perhaps my own, would allow one such as myself to hold converse with these outsiders, even if I did have the best translation skills in the 7 nests. At least, this is what I thought, as I cast my eyes upward towards the entrance of the first tower of knowledge. I shielded my eyes against the sun and watched as a dozen cranes wheeled in graceful circles about the tower before deftly alighting on the high balcony in human form, and entering. I sighed in frustration. I should explain. We have many libraries, many repositories of knowledge. Some you would recognize as such and others you may not, but nearly all are open and freely accessible to any who care to partake. The great knowledge, great wisdom, great words reside in the towers of knowledge. These are accessible only from the top, only to those who have attained the enlightenment, the wisdom, to fly in and reach them. Only these souls are trusted. Oh my God, I can't read today. Only these souls are trusted with direct contact with the most potent of our knowledge. This is where the meeting to discuss the outsiders would take place. This is where cranes gather. This was the repository of all my hopes and dreams. This is the knowledge I am barred from by my lack of wings. When I reached the courtyard where my students waited for me, I tore my eyes from the tower and temporarily abandoned hope of catching a glimpse of the strange women who flew without wings. I took a couple deep, centering breaths and, as many times before, briefly searched within the still parts of my being for a creature with grace, poise, and wide white wings, and found none resided there. Those places were far from empty, but what did lay there distinctly lacked feathers. But I get ahead of myself. I sat down amongst the fledglings gathered at the base of the first tower. I looked into my students' eager faces and had hope. I began to speak. We were not always as we are now. We did not always know the harmony we know today. We did not always strive to be at peace within and without, or to bring the light of wisdom to all who could perceive it. Once we were quite different from what we are now. Long ago, our fair country was a constantly warring conglomeration of city-states and land holdings, ruled by petty and arrogant namers, cruel men united only in culture and hatred of each other, and frequently beset by tribal raiders. This was a terrible, unenlightened time when power was signed for in the blood of others. The Namer Kings were fiercely secretive people, each working independently to accumulate power by discovering the true names of people and things, and using these names to control them. People were born into rather than rising to power, and power was both lawless and fleeting, and often a sort of trap in itself. Those who had it ruled over their subjects however they saw fit, and many were quite cruel. Land and people were both possessions and had no control over their destinies. Gender was an ascription rather than a choice, and marriage was a contract bound in steel. Men could coerce many wives, while women were bound inextricably to a single man who would treat his wives as he did his property. Women in the land-bound were forbidden to learn any of the secrets of naming, and allowed only to speak the common tongue, prosaeus, and speak only of common things. At this time, naming was not unified as it is now. Each namer, head of his own city-state or manors, would develop his own naming language and guard it fiercely, teaching only his sons and apprentices who had sworn themselves to him and been bound against betrayal. If multiple young men were trained, one would usually kill the others before claiming rulership. It was an erratic and idiosyncratic way to make sense of the world. Knowledge was gained and lost many times and was paid for too frequently in blood. Understanding was hard to translate, hard to disseminate, and so specific that it was difficult for another to use. Often, a young namer, taking on his father's research, might find an entire system of naming that he could not comprehend. and so training of one's children and apprentices from a young age to think exactly like oneself became common practice. Otherwise, all you had created might be lost as soon as you could no longer defend it. There was no freedom, even for those in power. Our beloved Crane Queen was the wife of such a tyrant. Her origins are lost to the mists of time, but likely she was the daughter of some other tyrant, traded to her husband to stop attacks on her father's land. Or she may have started as a landbound on her husband's land, using her wiles and intelligence to gain a more comfortable life. What we do know is that her name was Asara, and while the beginning of her story is tragic enough, fate and her own strength had other plans for her than to die the slave of such a master. Her rise to freedom is all of ours. This is the tale of our beloved first and final queen.